Accountability for one's mistakes and the willingness to take responsibility for them is in the pantheon of player qualities that will take you to the top most certainly. But even the staunchest self-flagellators at some point have winced at what they perceive to be jank or dishonesty as we know them. In this game, the goal is ending the set on the right side of the windscreen, and in the spirit of good sportsmanship, how that goal is achieved is vastly secondary to that it was achieved. But even if we say as much, I'm not entirely convinced that's how we all really feel. Sure, as serious competitors, we place the onus on ourselves exclusively to have done better, and this is the way things should be. We should take full responsibility for our losses and choices and adopt a radical no-Johns mentality. But doing so doesn't mean that our intuitive sense of lopsidedness that gives rise to such concepts such as jank and dishonesty in the first place is without explanation, even if we should and do rise above such feelings as sportsmen and press on. If the literal windscreen were truly all that we want, why aren't we satisfied when our opponent suffers a bizarre medical episode that causes them to immediately run off the edge twice in a row? And some might argue that things like SDing at early percent several times in a row is completely different from dying to a ZSS raised ladder at 40%. But the underlying reason for our dissatisfaction with such things is, I argue back, the very same, and as such the two aren't all that different in principle. Let's consider for a moment why we want to win in the first place. Do we generally find much satisfaction in things we accomplish on accident? If you're not memeing and being a normal, respectable human being, then the answer is usually a pretty flat no. Similarly, would you find much satisfaction in beating Zero if he had a heart attack and SD'd every stock at 10%? I find it personally hard to envision being at a party and bragging about a win like that, but maybe that's just me. It seems safe to say then, with that established, that in our somewhat idolatrous fixation on winning, we sometimes miss the point of why we want to win in the first place: understanding and mastery. Consider an example that I feel would elicit a similar reaction from many, if not most of us. A Pac-Man working over a DK for a solid 6 minutes, only to make 2 errors and lose the match for it. This begs 2 questions where we usually only beg one. The first of which is the one responsible competitors usually ask, and the one that will improve us as players. What could I have done to avoid that? What could I have done better? The second of which is one that will do nothing to improve us, but addresses our intuitive sense of dishonesty. To what degree did my opponent have to understand me to win? To what degree did I have to understand my opponent to win? The second question, while not particularly helpful or productive in obvious ways, does raise an interesting question. Is doing something wrong necessarily the same as the other person doing something right? Are winning and losing really 2 sides of the same coin? I claim that the way we frame winning and losing is completely wrong. When we try to directly compare 2 players in the midst of such staggering inequality, we start resorting to vague generalizations to reconcile our sense of fairness with an inherently unfair way of looking at things, like saying you outplayed Zero by not SDing twice in 12 seconds, or other such mental gymnastics, which to most of us just doesn't seem quite right to say, since when we view wins and losses through the lens of one player being directly superior to the other, presumably demonstrating superior understanding of them, it's naturally a bit onerous to be told you're inferior to someone you feel demonstrated less understanding of you than you of them. If we then conclude that direct comparisons aren't possible, we arrive at a secondary conclusion that maybe the extent of what we can say is simply how much understanding we feel either side demonstrated in accomplishing their different objective, irrespective of the other person. Therefore, I think the issue is less about outplaying, so to speak, and more about exercising a level of understanding necessary to accomplish your objective. A Pac-Man may have to pass the equivalent of a calculus exam to prevail over a DK, and the DK may need to pass the equivalent of a 5th grade spelling test. But ultimately, they're different objectives altogether, and as such, at the end of a match, I think the extent of what can be said is less that the DK is superior or inferior to the Pac-Man, or the Pac-Man to the DK, but that one accomplished their objective and the other failed. If you failed your calculus exam, it'd be nonsense to say you're inferior to your professor, but rather inferior simply to your own expectations of yourself. And this, of course, isn't to say certain things don't indicate the painfully vague notion of who's indeed the better player, but that our idolization of the act of winning itself overlooks a lot of details that make the concept of what it means to win in the midst of unevenness make more sense. Framing winning and losing as failure or success in entirely different objectives places the responsibility to perform better squarely on the loser, and dissolves the notion of dishonesty almost entirely, because the very idea of dishonesty is predicated on the idea that the other guy is taking the same test as you, so to speak, but is essentially using a calculator behind the teacher's back. Naturally, it's still no fun to be on the bad end of a rage ladder combo, but for me personally, this way of viewing things is sensible and resolves a lot of things we struggle to accept when we consider only who's in the foreground on the windscreen. But at that, I think I've driven my point to where I intended. Guys, thank you as always for taking the time to hear my thoughts. It is a privilege to be heard by you, and I do not take your time for granted, so I hope this video was worth its duration. It's a bit of a short video, but now that school's back in full swing for me, videos will still be coming, but certainly on a slower drip than over the summer. That being said, there is plenty more where this came from, so do not be shy about subscribing.